You might imagine Athens in the mid-5th century BCE as a place of unmatched brilliance. Marble temples gleamed in the Mediterranean sun, the Parthenon rising high above the city like a silent guardian. The air smelled faintly of olive groves and sea salt drifting in from the busy harbors of Piraeus. In the agora merchants sold amphorae of wine, pottery painted with scenes of myths, and fine linen brought from distant lands. Citizens debated in shaded porticos about philosophy, law, and the affairs of the city. This was, by all accounts, the height of Athens' golden age, a period that many later historians would regard as the pinnacle of Greek culture. Yet, even in golden light, shadows can grow. The rivalry between Athens and Sparta had deep roots. It was not merely a clash of armies, but of entire ways of life. Athens was a democracy, an experiment that gave a voice to male citizens, at least those of free birth and property. It was also a naval power, its triremes cutting through the Aegean like blades. Sparta, by contrast, was a militaristic oligarchy. Its society built on discipline, obedience, and the iron rule of a warrior elite. Where Athens valued open debate and art, Sparta valued silence, endurance, and the perfection of the soldier's craft. The seeds of the Peloponnesian War were sown long before the first spear was thrown. After the Persian Wars, Athens had led the Delian League, a coalition formed to protect the Greek world from further Persian aggression. The League's treasury was originally on the island of Delos, but in time, Athens moved it to the Acropolis. That decision was more than symbolic. It turned a mutual defense pact into something resembling an Athenian empire. League members found themselves paying tribute, and dissent was met with harsh reprisals. Some city-states welcomed Athens' protection, others began to resent it. Sparta, meanwhile, had its own alliance, the Peloponnesian League. It was a looser federation, dominated by Sparta but less centralized than Athens' network. Tensions flared as these two blocs competed for influence in the Greek world. A minor quarrel over a small city could as quickly escalate into a matter of national honor. The first open hostilities came in for 60 BCE, in what historians now call the First Peloponnesian War. This was a decade of skirmishes, shifting alliances, and uneasy truces. Neither side emerged as an unquestioned victor, but both left the battlefield with deeper mistrust. The 30 Years' Peace was signed in 446 BCE, meant to prevent further conflict. It would last barely half that time. By the 430s BCE, the situation was deteriorating again. Athens' growing power alarmed Sparta. The spark came from Corinth, a Spartan ally, and Corcyra, modern Corfu, which was in conflict with Corinth. Athens backed Corcyra, setting off a chain reaction of disputes that led to war. In 431 BCE, the Peloponnesian War began in earnest. At first, it was a war of strategies rather than decisive battles. Sparta's strength lay on land, hoplites in tight phalanx formations, shields locked, spears bristling. Athens avoided direct confrontation on open ground. Instead, under the guidance of its leader Pericles, it withdrew the population behind the long walls that connected the city to its port. Supplies could come in by sea, and the navy could raid the Peloponnesian coast. Sparta, lacking a strong fleet, could not easily strike at Athens' lifeline, but walls can protect and also imprison. Crowded within the city, the Athenians faced an invisible enemy. In 430 BCE, a plague swept through Athens, killing tens of thousands, perhaps a third of its population, including Pericles himself. The war had only just begun, and already Athens had lost its most capable statesman. The plague did more than kill. It shook the moral foundations of Athenian society. The historian Thucydides, who himself survived the illness, wrote that lawlessness spread as citizens no longer feared divine punishment or human justice. Ceremonies were abandoned, funerals became hurried affairs, and the rhythm of daily life broke down. for a city that prided itself on order, beauty, and reason, it was a grim transformation. Sparta did not escape hardship. Its campaigns in Attica destroyed farmland, but failed to deliver a decisive blow. The war dragged on, season after season, year after year, with neither side able to claim victory. Both began to seek allies beyond Greece itself, drawing in Persian gold and mercenaries. The conflict was expanding beyond its original scope, pulling in distant powers and distant seas. In these early years of the war, hope still flickered in both Athens and Sparta. Each believed it could outlast the other, but the seeds of decline had already been sown in the fields left fallow by Spartan raids, in the harbors blockaded by Athenian ships, and in the quiet erosion of trust between allies. The Greek world was fracturing, not in a single dramatic collapse, but in a slow unraveling that would take decades to complete. And yet, both sides were evenly matched in strength and resolve. What hidden forces would eventually tip the balance toward one and bring the other to its knees? The war that had begun as a clash between Athens and Sparta now began to seep into every corner of the Greek world. No city-state was truly untouched. Some tried to remain neutral, but neutrality in such a climate was fragile, often shattered by the movement of fleets or the march of hoplites through their lands. After the plague, Athens found itself in a precarious position. The loss of Pericles had left the city without a leader of his vision and steadiness. In his place came men like Cleon, populist, whose fierce rhetoric appealed to a citizenry weary of Spartan incursions, yet unwilling to yield. Cleon advocated for a more aggressive stance, pushing the war beyond mere defense into offensive strikes. One such opportunity came in 425 BCE, when the Athenians fortified the small harbor of Pylos, deep in Spartan territory. The Spartans moved to retake it, but in the fighting, a group of their soldiers, elite Spartiates, became stranded on the nearby island of Spactaria. Athens seized the moment. After a tense siege, the Spartans surrendered. For the first time in memory, Spartan warriors had been taken alive in significant numbers. This event sent shockwaves through Greece. The Spartans, renowned for their discipline and refusal to surrender, had been humiliated. Athens held its prisoners as leverage, a bargaining chip that would shape the next phase of the war. But such advantages rarely last forever. By 421 BCE, both sides were exhausted. Crops had been burned, fleets worn down, treasuries drained. The Peace of Nicias was signed, meant to restore the status quo and bring respite. Yet the ink was barely dry before hostilities resumed in scattered places. The Greek world was too fractured, too entangled in alliances and grudges, court peace to truly take hold. Then came the decision that would change Athens' fate forever. The Sicilian expedition. The plan, conceived in 415 BCE, was to send a massive fleet to Sicily to aid the city of Segesta against its rival, Syracuse. Sicily was far from Greece, but rich in grain and resources. If Athens could secure it, it would gain a strategic advantage against Sparta. The scale of the expedition was unprecedented. Over 130 triremes, thousands of soldiers, and an air of confidence that bordered on hubris. But the omens were not favorable. On the eve of departure, the sacred statues of Hermes across Athens were vandalized, their faces smashed. This act was seen as a bad sign, perhaps even a conspiracy, but the fleet sailed anyway, under the command of Alcibiades, a brilliant but controversial figure that almost immediately things unraveled. Alcibiades was recalled to face charges of impiety, but instead defected to Sparta. His advice to the Spartans would prove devastating for Athens. Meanwhile, the Athenian forces in Sicily found themselves bogged down in a siege against Syracuse, facing fierce resistance, and eventually the intervention of a Spartan general, Philippus. What followed was one of the most disastrous campaigns in ancient history. The Athenian fleet was trapped in the harbor. their attempts to break free thwarted. In 413 BCE, the entire force was either killed or captured. The loss of ships, soldiers, and morale was staggering, a blow from which Athens would never fully recover. Back in Greece, Sparta took the offensive. Fortified in Decelea, a mere 12 miles from Athens, they cut off the city from its land roots, forcing it to rely even more heavily on imported grain. Persian gold began flowing to Sparta, funding the creation of a navy to challenge Athens at sea. The war had entered a new and more dangerous phase. No longer was Athens the confident maritime empire of the early years. It was now fighting for survival, bleeding, resources, allies, and hope. Yet, even as defeat loomed, the Athenians clung to their identity as a city of debate, of art, of restless ambition. They rebuilt fleets, struck at Spartan positions, and searched for ways to turn the tide. But the balance of power was shifting, and not in their favor. And so, one must wonder, when a city refuses to surrender, is it resilience that sustains it, or the stubbornness that hastens its fall? By the final decade of the Peloponnesian War, Athens was a shadow of the city it had been at the conflict's start. The proud fleet that once dominated the Aegean had been rebuilt more than once, each time at enormous cost, each time with fewer allies to draw upon. Its great treasury, once swollen with tribute from the Delian League, was now nearly empty. Sparta, bolstered by Persian funding and guided by commanders who had learned from years of maritime defeat, had become a new kind of power, one that could meet Athens not just on land, but at sea. Under the leadership of Lysander, a commander with both patience and political skill, the Spartans began tightening the noose. The decisive moment came at the Battle of Ecospotamoi in 405 BCE. Athens' fleet, anchored on the shores of the Hellespont, was caught off guard. Lysander waited for the Athenians to grow complacent, launching his attack when most of their crews were scattered ashore. In a sudden strike, almost the entire Athenian navy was destroyed. Those few ships that escaped could do nothing to protect the city's supply lines. With their grain routes from the Black Sea cut, famine descended upon Athens. Inside the long walls, the people endured months of hunger. The once vibrant marketplace grew quiet, stalls standing empty, the agora filled, instead, with thin, weary faces. Citizens who had once debated politics now stood in line for scraps of bread. In the spring of 404 BCE, the inevitable could no longer be delayed. The Athenian assembly voted to surrender. The terms were harsh. The long walls were to be demolished, the fleet reduced to a handful of ships, and Athens was to join the Spartan alliance as a subordinate state. Lysander entered the city, overseeing the destruction of the walls to the sound of Spartan flutes, a calculated humiliation. Yet, in a strange way, Athens did not die. Within years, democracy would be restored, and the city would remain a center of culture, philosophy, and art, but it would never again hold the kind of political and military dominance it had enjoyed before the war. The Peloponnesian War had not just pitted Athens against Sparta, it had fractured the Greek world. City-state turned against city-state, and the unity that might have resisted outside threats was gone. In time, this division would open the door for a new power rising in the north, Macedon under Philip II, and later his son, Alexander. The fall of Athens in 404 BCE was not just the end of one war. It was the closing of a chapter in Greek history, a reminder that empires, no matter how confident, are built on fragile foundations. And so, as the dust settled on the broken stones of the long walls, one could ask, did Athens lose because Sparta was stronger, or because Athens' own ambition had pulled it too far from the safety of its own shores? Would you like me to begin Story 2, Section 1 next? This will continue the overarching narrative of how the Greek Empire fell, moving to the next pivotal chapter in its decline. You said, yes, ChatGPT said, Alright, here's story 2. Section 1 for boring history. 4. Sleep, How the Greek Empire Fell. Written in the same calm, immersive style. Story 2. The Rise of Macedon. Section 1. A Kingdom in the Shadows for Centuries. The heart of Greek political life had been the city-states, independent, fiercely proud, and often at odds with one another. Athens, Sparta, Corinth, Thebes, these names carried weight in the Greek world. Far to the north, beyond the well-known city-state alliances, lay a land that most Greeks regarded with a mixture of condescension and suspicion: Macedon. Macedon was not like the great Peleus of the south. It was a kingdom, not a democracy or oligarchy, ruled by a hereditary monarch. Its people spoke a dialect of Greek that some in Athens and Sparta dismissed as coarse, even barbaric. Its lands were mountainous and its settlements scattered, and though it possessed fertile plains, it lacked the monumental architecture or philosophical traditions of its southern neighbors. Macedon had one advantage that the fractured city-states did not unity under a single ruler. The king of Macedon commanded loyalty from a nobility that tied his fortunes to his, and he could draw on the resources of an entire region without the need to negotiate with rival cities. In the early 4th century BCE, the Greek world was still reeling from the Peloponnesian War and its aftermath. Sparta's victory had not brought peace. It had only shifted the balance of power, leading to new conflicts as former allies turned against one another. Thebes rose in strength, humbling Sparta at the Battle of Leuctra in 371 BCE. But their dominance was short-lived. Athens rebuilt its fleet, seeking to reclaim influence, but found itself mired in more wars, including one against its former allies, in the so-called Social War. In this climate of exhaustion and rivalry, Macedon began to transform. King Amyntas III stabilized the kingdom after years of instability, and his successors strengthened its position. But it was under Philip II, who came to the throne in 359 BCE, that Macedon's fortunes truly changed. Philip inherited a kingdom under threat from all sides: Illyrian raids from the northwest, Thracian incursions from the east, and internal disputes among the nobility. Yet, Philip approached these challenges with a patience and strategic vision that few had expected. He reorganized the army, introducing the sarissa, a long pike that would become the hallmark of the Macedonian phalanx. This weapon, combined with disciplined training and flexible tactics, would give his soldiers an advantage over the traditional hoplite formations of the Greek city-states. While he strengthened his military, Philip also mastered the art of diplomacy. He married strategically, forging alliances with neighboring powers. He offered peace with one hand and threats with the other, always keeping his opponents divided. Where Athens and Sparta exhausted themselves in endless disputes, Macedon grew, stronger in the quiet spaces between their wars. By the time the southern Greeks began to notice Macedon's rise, it was already too late to dismiss it as a backwater. Philip's forces began to move southward, intervening in disputes and presenting himself as both a mediator and a conqueror. Some cities welcomed him as a protector, others saw him as an ambitious threat. Still, one question lingered over the Greek world: could this northern kingdom, so long considered an outsider, truly reshape the fate of all Greece? For centuries, the heart of Greek political life had been the city-states, independent, fiercely proud, and often at odds with one another. Athens, Sparta, Corinth, Thebes, these names carried weight in the Greek world. Far to the north, beyond the well-known city-state alliances, lay a land that most Greeks regarded with a mixture of condescension and suspicion: Macedon. Macedon was not like the great Peleus of the south. It was a kingdom, not a democracy or oligarchy, ruled by a hereditary monarch. Its people spoke a dialect of Greek that some in Athens and Sparta dismissed as coarse, even barbaric. Its lands were mountainous and its settlements scattered, And, though it possessed fertile plains, Crete lacked the monumental architecture or philosophical traditions of its southern neighbors. Yet, Macedon had one advantage that the fractured city-states did not: unity under a single ruler. The king of Macedon commanded loyalty from a nobility that tied its fortunes to his, and he could draw on the resources of an entire region without the need to negotiate with rival cities. In the early 4th century BCE, the Greek world was still reeling from the Peloponnesian War and its aftermath. Sparta's victory had not brought peace. It had only shifted the balance of power, leading to new conflicts as former allies turned against one another. Thebes rose in strength, humbling Sparta at the Battle of Leuctra in 371 BCE, but their dominance was short-lived. Athens rebuilt its fleet, seeking to reclaim influence, but found itself mired in more wars, including one against its former allies in the so-called Social War. In this climate of exhaustion and rivalry, Macedon began to transform. King Amyntas III stabilized the kingdom after years of instability, and his successors strengthened its position. But it was under Philip II, who came to the throne in 359 BCE, that Macedon's fortunes truly changed. Philip inherited a kingdom under threat from all sides: Illyrian raids from the northwest, Thracian incursions from the east, and internal disputes among the nobility. Yet Philip approached these challenges with a patience and strategic vision that few had expected. He reorganized the army, introducing the sarissa, a long pike that would become the hallmark of the Macedonian phalanx. This weapon, combined with disciplined training and flexible tactics, would give his soldiers an advantage over the traditional hoplite formations of the Greek city-states, while he strengthened his military. Philip also mastered the art of diplomacy. He married strategically, forging alliances with neighboring powers. He offered peace with one hand and threats with the other, always keeping his opponents divided. Where Athens and Sparta exhausted themselves in endless disputes, Macedon grew stronger in the quiet spaces between their wars. By the time the southern Greeks began to notice Macedon's rise, it was already too late to dismiss it as a backwater. Philip's forces began to move southward, intervening in disputes and presenting himself as both a mediator and a conqueror. Some cities welcomed him as a protector. Others saw him as an ambitious threat. Still, one question lingered over the Greek world: could this northern kingdom, so long considered an outsider, truly reshape the fate of all Greece? By the mid-4th century BCE, Philip II's ambitions were no longer subtle. His reforms had turned the Macedonian army into one of the most formidable forces in the known world. Hayes, and his use of marriage alliances, had drawn many of his neighbors into his sphere of influence. Yet the city-states of southern Greece still resisted the idea of submitting to Macedon. The spark came, as it often did in the Greek world, from local disputes. In 356 BCE, Philip intervened in a quarrel over the city of Amphipolis, a strategically important settlement controlling access to valuable gold and silver mines. Athens, which had long coveted Amphipolis, saw Philip's actions as a direct challenge. Over the next decade, the two powers would clash repeatedly, sometimes through open war, sometimes through diplomatic maneuvering. Philip understood that the key to southern Greece lay in presenting himself not simply as a conqueror, but as a champion of Pan-Hellenic unity. He began to position himself as the natural leader of all Greeks against the growing threat from Persia. This message found some support, especially among smaller city-states weary of Athenian or Spartan dominance. But Athens and Thebes remained wary. Each had memories of former glory, and each still commanded enough resources to rally others against Macedon. Tensions escalated during the so-called Sacred Wars, a series of conflicts nominally fought over control of the sacred site of Delphi. In reality, these wars became a stage for Philip's gradual expansion into central Greece. in 346 BCE. Philip was invited to mediate the sacred war, a role he accepted eagerly. His settlement favored his allies and positioned Macedon as the protector of the sacred sites, a title that gave him a legitimate reason to intervene in future disputes. For Athens, this was a troubling sign. The northern kingdom was no longer just a distant concern. It was becoming an unavoidable power in their affairs. The final confrontation came in 338 BCE at the Battle of Chaeronea. Athens and Thebes, setting aside their old rivalries, formed an alliance to resist Philip's advance. They assembled a force to block him in central Greece, hoping to halt Macedonian expansion once and for all. The battle was fierce, fought on the plain near the small town of Chaeronea. On one flank, the Theban sacred band, an elite corps of 300 warriors, renowned for their courage, held their ground against relentless assaults. On the other, young Alexander, Philip's son and heir, commanded the Macedonian cavalry, executing a daring maneuver that broke through the Athenian lines. By day's end, the allied army was shattered. The Theban sacred band was annihilated, fighting to the last man. Athens was forced to submit, and Philip's dominance over Greece was secured. Yet, for all the drama of the battlefield, the deeper transformation lay elsewhere in the quiet acceptance, even among his former enemies, that the age of independent city-states was ending. A new order had emerged, one in which Greece would speak with a single voice, though under a Macedonian king. Still, one question hung over Philip's triumph. Would his vision for a united Greece survive long enough to face the challenge he most desired, the conquest of Persia? By the mid-4th century BCE, Philip II's ambitions were no longer subtle. His reforms had turned the Macedonian army into one of the most formidable forces in the known world, and his use of marriage alliances had drawn many of his neighbors into his sphere of influence. Yet the city-states of southern Greece still resisted the idea of submitting to Macedon. The spark came, as it often did in the Greek world, from local disputes. In 356 BCE, Philip intervened in a quarrel over the city of Amphipolis, a strategically important settlement controlling access to valuable gold and silver mines. Athens, which had long coveted Amphipolis, saw Philip's actions as a direct challenge. Over the next decade, the two powers would clash repeatedly, sometimes through open war, sometimes through diplomatic maneuvering. Philip understood that the key to southern Greece lay in presenting himself not simply as a conqueror, but as a champion of pan-Hellenic unity. He began to position himself as the natural leader of all Greeks against the growing threat from Persia. This message found some support, especially among smaller city-states weary of Athenian or Spartan dominance. But Athens and Thebes remained weary. Each had memories of former glory, and each still commanded enough resources to rally others against Macedon. Tensions escalated during the so-called Sacred Wars, a series of conflicts nominally fought over control of the sacred site of Delphi. In reality, these wars became a stage for Philip's gradual expansion into central Greece. In 346 BCE, Philip was invited to mediate the sacred war, a role he accepted eagerly. His settlement favored his allies and positioned Macedon as the protector of the sacred sites, a title that gave him a legitimate reason to intervene in future disputes. For Athens, this was a troubling sign. The northern kingdom was no longer just a distant concern. It was becoming an unavoidable power in their affairs. The final confrontation came in 338 BCE at the Battle of Chaeronea. Athens and Thebes, setting aside their old rivalries, formed an alliance to resist Philip's advance. They assembled a force to block him in central Greece, hoping to halt Macedonian expansion once and for all. The battle was fierce, fought on the plain near the small town of Chaeronea. On one flank, the Theban sacred band, an elite corps of 300 warriors, renowned for their courage, held their ground against relentless assaults. On the other, young Alexander, Philip's son and heir, commanded the Macedonian cavalry, executing a daring maneuver that broke through the Athenian lines. By day's end, the allied army was shattered. The Theban sacred band was annihilated, fighting to the last man. Athens was forced to submit, and Philip's dominance over Greece was secured. Yet, for all the drama of the battlefield, the deeper transformation lay elsewhere in the quiet acceptance, even among his former enemies, that the age of independent city-states was ending. A new order had emerged, one in which Greece would speak with a single voice. Though under a Macedonian king, still, one question hung over Philip's triumph. Would his vision for a united Greece survive long enough to face the challenge he most desired? The conquest of Persia. The aftermath of Chaeronea was not the chaotic plundering that Greek city-states had come to expect after defeat. Philip II understood that his long-term goal required stability, not devastation. He entered Athens not as a destroyer, but as a negotiator. The Athenians, wary yet pragmatic, offered peace, and Philip responded with terms that were surprisingly generous. Prisoners were released without ransom. The city retained its autonomy, and its citizens were spared the humiliation of occupation. This was not mere kindness. Philip needed Athens' formidable navy for the next phase of his vision, an invasion of the Persian Empire. By the mid-330s BCE, Persia's western territories in modern-day Turkey were weakened by internal strife. For a leader with the resources of a united Greece, the idea of striking at the ancient enemy was not only feasible, but tempting. In 337 BCE, Philip convened the League of Corinth, an unprecedented gathering of Greek states under his leadership. The League's stated purpose was clear: to wage war against Persia in retaliation for the invasions of the previous century. Behind the rhetoric lay Philip's personal ambition to cement his legacy as the liberator of Greek cities under Persian control and as the ruler who brought lasting unity to the Greek world. The campaign's preparations were vast and methodical. Engineers designed supply routes to sustain an army deep into Asia. Diplomats secured the loyalty, or at least the submission, of fractious Greek allies, and treasuries were filled with gold from Macedonian mines. Kievan Philip's marriages played a role, linking him to influential dynasties across the region. Yet, the very moment his plans seemed ready to unfold, events at home altered the course of history. In 336 BCE, during the wedding celebrations of his daughter Cleopatra, Philip was assassinated. The killer, one of his own bodyguards, was cut down almost immediately, leaving the true motives shrouded in speculation. Was it personal revenge? A political conspiracy? Foreign interference? Historians still debate the sudden death of the man who had reshaped the Greek world through the future into uncertainty. The delicate balance Philip had maintained between conquest and conciliation now rested in the hands of his 20-year-old son, Alexander. Many wondered if the young king could hold together the fragile unity his father had built, or if the Greek city-states, freed from Philip's authority, would revert to their old rivalries. The answer would come soon enough, but it was not the one most expected. For, while Philip had built the foundation, it would be Alexander who carried the Macedonian vision beyond Greece's borders and into the heart of Persia itself. And so, as the Macedonian sun set on one reign and rose on another, the question lingered in the minds of many Greeks: had the age of city-states truly ended? Or was it merely waiting for the next great test? When Alexander ascended the Macedonian throne in 336 BCE, few could have predicted that within a decade his name would echo from the shores of Greece to the edges of India. At only 20 years old, he inherited not just his father's crown, but also an unfinished mission to unite Greece under one banner and to carry war into the heart of the Persian Empire. The first test of his rule came almost immediately. News of Philip's death spread quickly across the Greek world, and many city-states, sensing an opportunity, began to stir in rebellion. Thebes, Athens, and others whispered of breaking free from Macedonian dominance. Alexander responded with swiftness that would become his hallmark in a matter of months. He marched south with his seasoned Macedonian army, presenting a show of force that made hesitation seem the wiser choice for most. Athens submitted without battle, but Thebes defied him and paid a terrible price. The city was taken and destroyed, its population sold into slavery. It was a brutal reminder that the unity Philip had forged was not voluntary. It was enforced, and Alexander would tolerate no challenge while his greater mission waited across the Aegean. With Greece subdued, Alexander turned to the campaign that had been the cornerstone of his father's ambitions, the invasion of Persia. The Persian Empire, though vast, was not at its strongest. Years of internal strife, satrapal rebellions, and court intrigues had weakened its capacity to respond quickly to threats on its borders. Still, the scale of what Alexander planned was daunting. In the spring of 334 BCE, he crossed the Hellespont with approximately 40,000 soldiers, Macedonians, Greeks, and allied troops, before stepping onto Asian soil. He performed a symbolic act, visiting the legendary site of Troy. There, according to tradition, he honored the tomb of Achilles, claiming the ancient hero as his ancestor and role model. Whether this was pure symbolism or a calculated move to link his campaign to the most famous war in Greek memory, it was a gesture that spoke to his understanding of the power of myth. The first major clash came at the Battle of the Granicus River. The Persian satraps, underestimating the young king, attempted to block his advance. The fighting was fierce, with Alexander personally leading a cavalry charge across the river. Against expectations, the Macedonians prevailed, scattering the Persian forces and opening the road into Asia Minor. Victory at the Granicus was more than a battlefield triumph. It was a psychological blow to Persia. Greek cities in Asia Minor, long under Persian control, began to open their gates to Alexander, seeing him as a liberator rather than a conqueror. He reinforced this image by granting many of these cities autonomy and restoring their democratic institutions, a sharp contrast to Persian rule. Yet this image of magnanimity was always balanced by ruthless pragmatism. Those who resisted were dealt with swiftly and harshly, ensuring that word of both his generosity and his ferocity traveled ahead of him. But Persia was not yet beaten. The great king, Darius III, was assembling a massive army to confront the invader. The meeting of these two leaders, one the youthful and ambitious Macedonian, the other the ruler of the largest empire in the world, would determine whether Alexander's campaign would end in swift glory or humiliating defeat. And as the Macedonian army marched deeper into unfamiliar lands, the question loomed: could Alexander's relentless drive match the vast resources and entrenched power of Persia? By the autumn of 333 BCE, Alexander's army had moved steadily along the western coast of Asia Minor, securing cities and fortresses with a mixture of diplomacy and decisive force. The campaign was progressing, but the pace was deliberate. Each step into Persian territory meant stretching his supply lines, keeping restless subject cities in line, preparing for an inevitable showdown with the great king. That confrontation came sooner than some expected. Darius III, determined to stop the Macedonian advance before it could threaten the heart of his empire, assembled a vast army. Sources from the time claim it numbered hundreds of thousands, though modern historians doubt such figures. Still, it was far larger than Alexander's force, and the imbalance in manpower was stark. The two armies met near the town of Issus, on a narrow coastal plain between the mountains and the sea. This geography would prove decisive. Darius, despite his numerical advantage, had little room to deploy his full force, compressing the battlefield and negating some of his superiority. Alexander, recognizing this, prepared to strike. The day was cool, with the sea breeze cutting through the air, but tension made the soldiers sweat beneath their armor. The Persian lines stretched across the plain, their ranks glittering with bronze and steel. In the center stood Darius himself, surrounded by his elite guard. Alexander placed himself on the right flank, commanding his companion cavalry. His plan was to lead a direct assault on the Persian left, while his infantry held firm in the center. If he could punch through the flank, he could wheel inward toward Darius himself, a dangerous gamble, but one that could end a battle quickly. When the fighting began, it was fierce and chaotic. The Persian archers loosed volleys of arrows that darkened the sky, but the Macedonian phalanx pressed forward, their long sarissas holding back the enemy infantry. On the right, Alexander led a furious charge, driving his cavalry into the Persian lines with such force that the enemy flank began to crumble. Then came the critical moment. Seeing a gap in the Persian formation, Alexander spurred his horse straight toward Darius. The great king, perhaps caught off guard by the speed of the maneuver, chose not to stand his ground. Counts tell of him fleeing the field in his chariot, leaving behind his family and personal guard. Whether this was an act of cowardice or a calculated decision to preserve himself for another fight, the effect was immediate. The Persian army broke. The Macedonians pursued the fleeing Persians, capturing not only treasure and supplies, but also Darius's wife, mother, and children. Alexander, in a gesture that impressed even his enemies, treated them with dignity and respect, ensuring their comfort and safety. This act, like so many of his choices, served both personal honor and political strategy, portraying him as a noble conqueror rather than a mere invader. The victory at Issus was a turning point. It shattered the illusion of Persian invincibility and opened the way for Alexander to push deeper into the empire. But it also marked the beginning of a new challenge. Darius, though humiliated, still commanded vast resources and could regroup. And further east, the empire stretched into lands unfamiliar to the Macedonians' deserts, mountains, and cities, unlike anything in Greece or Asia Minor. Asterisk. As the army marched south toward the Phoenician coast, Alexander's gaze was already fixed on its next goal, securing control of the eastern Mediterranean and cutting off Persia's naval strength. But first, he would face one of the most stubborn sieges of his career, a test not of battlefield speed, but of patience and endurance. Asterisk. After the triumph at Issus, Alexander knew that Persian power could not be broken solely on land. The great king still possessed a formidable navy, supplied and supported by the wealthy Phoenician port cities along the eastern Mediterranean. If Alexander could secure these ports, he would cut off Darius's ability to threaten Greece and Macedonia by sea. Many of these cities surrendered quickly, opening their gates to the Macedonian king. But Tyre, a proud, wealthy island city just off the coast, was different. Its walls rose high above the sea, and its people were renowned sailors and merchants. They were willing to acknowledge Alexander's authority in principle, but they refused to allow him into their city. To Alexander, this was unacceptable. He could not leave such a powerful and defiant city behind him, especially when it could serve as a Persian naval base. And so began one of the most remarkable sieges in the ancient world. The problem was simple. Tyre was an island half a mile from shore, with walls rising nearly 150 feet above the water. Alexander's army had no fleet large enough to blockade it, and a direct assault from the sea was impossible. So he chose an audacious solution. He would build a causeway, a massive bridge of stone and timber, stretching from the mainland to the city's walls. The work began slowly, under constant harassment from Tyrian ships. Macedonian soldiers and laborers hauled stone from the surrounding countryside, sinking it into the shallow water near the shore. As the causeway extended outward, the water deepened, and the work became more difficult. Tyrian ships attacked, constantly using fire to burn siege equipment and archers to harass the workers. In response, Alexander ordered the construction of massive siege towers on the causeway, each covered in rawhide to resist fire and armed with catapults to return fire against the city's defenders. The struggle turned into a grinding contest of endurance. Progress was slow, but Alexander refused to abandon the project. Months passed. Causeway crept closer to Tyre, but the city's resistance was fierce. At last, Alexander summoned fleets from his newly allied Phoenician ports, assembling a powerful navy. With ships surrounding the island, the blockade was complete. Now, Tyre faced attacks, both from land and sea. When the final assault came, it was brutal. Ships battered the walls from the sea, while siege towers on the causeway pounded them from the landward side. Eventually, a breach was made. Macedonian soldiers poured into the city, fighting street by street. The aftermath was grim. Historical accounts say thousands of Tyrians were killed, and many more were sold into slavery. The city's defiance had been crushed, and Alexander's control over the eastern Mediterranean was secure. The siege of Tyre became a symbol of Alexander's determination. He was willing to spend months overcoming an obstacle that others might have bypassed, and he had the engineering skill to turn an impossible assault into reality. But it also showed the harsher side of his rule. Mercy was possible for those who surrendered, but for those who resisted, there was little forgiveness. With Tyre subdued, Tander turned his attention southward, toward Egypt and beyond. His path through the Persian Empire was far from over, and the shadow of Darius still loomed. Yet, for now, the coasts were his, and the march of the Macedonians could continue without fear of a naval threat. What awaited Alexander next was not a fortified city, but a desert, a journey to a place where the line between history and legend would blur, and where a strange oracle would speak words that would follow him for the rest of his life. Asterisk. When Alexander marched south from Tyre in 332 BCE, he found Egypt weary of Persian rule. For centuries, Egypt had been a rich prize for conquerors, first for its own pharaohs, then for the Persians, who had incorporated it into their empire. Yet Persian control had never been secure. Local uprisings had flared repeatedly, and the people longed for a ruler who might bring stability and respect for their traditions. Alexander entered Egypt without a battle. The Persian satrap surrendered, and the Macedonian king was welcomed as a liberator. To the Egyptians, he was not just a foreign general. He was a chance for the restoration of their ancient order, however symbolic. The arrival in Memphis, Egypt's old capital, was marked by ceremonies steeped in both Macedonian and Egyptian custom. Priests offered blessings. The local nobility came forward to pay homage. Alexander, who understood the value of public image, embraced Egyptian traditions with deliberate care. He took part in sacrifices to Egyptian gods, wearing the symbols of pharaonic authority. In the eyes of the people, Alexander was now pharaoh, the living embodiment of divine kingship. But to Alexander, the title was not merely ceremonial. Egypt offered wealth, grain, and a secure base from which to move east toward the heart of Persia. Even in the calm of his arrival, Alexander's mind was fixed on grand designs. He visited the Nile Delta and surveyed land for a new city. The site he chose would become Alexandria, a port that would, in time, rival any city of the ancient world. Positioned between the Nile and the Mediterranean, it would be a hub of trade, culture, and learning. Alexander himself would never see its greatness, but his choice of location was deliberate, a city that could unite the worlds of Greece and Egypt. But before his march resumed, Alexander made a decision that has puzzled historians for centuries. He would travel deep into the Libyan desert, to the Siwa oasis, home to a sacred oracle of the god Ammon. Why? Some say it was to seek divine guidance for his next campaigns. Others suggest he wanted to confirm rumors about his own birth, whispers that he was not the son of Philip of Macedon, but the child of a god. The journey would be long and dangerous. The desert was unforgiving, and the route to Siwa was marked by vast stretches of sand, where the sun could blind and the wind could bury whole armies. Yet Alexander was determined. His closest companions, accustomed to his relentless pace, prepared for the expedition. The march began under the pale light of dawn. Soldiers and camels moved in slow rhythm across the dunes, carrying water and provisions. Tick. The air was dry, the horizon endless. For days they pressed on, and stories from the time speak of miraculous events, unexpected rain, or birds that guided them when the path was uncertain. Whether these tales were fact or embellishment, they became part of a legend that grew around Alexander. Last, the green palms of Siwa appeared, rising like an island from the sea of sand. The oracle's temple stood within, its walls worn by centuries of wind, its priests waiting. What would be said within those walls, and whether it was truth, flattery, or something stranger, would follow Alexander for the rest of his life. The temple at Siwa was small compared to the vast sanctuaries of Greece or Egypt, but its isolation gave it a different kind of power. Surrounded by the desert on all sides, the oasis felt like a place cut off from the rest of the world. The palm trees swayed gently in a hot breeze, and the air smelled faintly of salt from underground springs. Alexander dismounted before the temple, leaving his companions at a respectful distance. Inside, the corridors were narrow and dim, the walls etched with images of the ram-horned god Ammon. The priests moved in silence, their steps measured, their eyes calm. What happened next is known only in fragments, for Alexander never spoke of the oracle's exact words. Ancient writers recorded different versions. Some claimed the priest addressed him as son of Zeus Hammon, acknowledging him as a child of the gods. Others said the oracle assured him of his destiny to conquer the Persian Empire. A few even hinted that he asked about his father's killers, and the oracle refused to speak further, whatever was said. Alexander left the temple with a quiet but unmistakable sense of certainty. His behavior in the months and years to come suggested that the meeting had reinforced an idea he already held, that his rule was divinely sanctioned, and that his destiny was greater than that of any ordinary king. Before leaving the oasis, Alexander honored the traditions of the place, offering sacrifices and gifts to the priests. The journey back to the Nile was less perilous, though the desert's stillness had a way of magnifying one's thoughts. Perhaps Alexander replayed the oracle's words in his mind, turning them over like stones in a river, each time finding a slightly different meaning. When he returned to Memphis, preparations for the next phase of his campaign began in earnest. Chaeron's army, rested and well supplied, was eager for action. The Persian king Darius III still ruled from the east, as Alexander's victory at Issus 2 years earlier had been only the beginning. Egypt was secure for now, but his ambitions reached beyond it. Yet something had shifted in the way. Alexander presented himself. His adoption of Egyptian royal customs had been politically practical before, but now there was an added weight to it. He wore symbols of divinity more readily. His correspondence to Greek cities began to carry the tone of one who ruled not only by force of arms, by divine right. The fusion of Greek and Egyptian identity was deliberate. In Alexandria, which was already rising from the sand, Greek architects planned grand streets while Egyptian craftsmen shaped temples. The blending of cultures, so central to Alexander's vision, was taking root in stone. But beneath the calm of Egypt's new order, the East was calling. Darius had regrouped. The Persian Empire's wealth and armies were formidable, and Alexander knew the confrontation that would decide its fate was approaching as he set sail from Egypt toward Phoenicia, the waters of the Mediterranean reflecting the sky above. One question lingered: had the oracle truly spoken the will of the gods? Or had it merely told Alexander what he wanted to hear? And if the words were his own to interpret, did that make them more or less powerful? Asterisk. Alexander's departure from Egypt in 331 BCE was quiet in ceremony, but heavy with intent. He had left behind a land reorganized under his control. Alexandria was taking shape on the coast. The temples acknowledged him as pharaoh, and the priests of Ammon had affirmed his divine status. But his eyes, and the eyes of his companions, were fixed firmly eastward. The Persian Empire still loomed, vast and unbroken. Darius III had not disappeared after the defeat at Issus. He had retreated, rebuilt, and gathered an army that dwarfed anything Alexander had yet faced. The coming battle would decide not only the fate of Persia, the balance of power across much of the known world. The journey from Egypt to the eastern satrapies was long, weaving through Phoenician ports, where Alexander ensured loyalty and gathered supplies. His fleet patrolled the coastline, while his army moved steadily inland, crossing the fertile plains of Syria. The heat of the Levant was different from the Egyptian desert, heavier, humid, and scented with the resin of pine and cypress. By the time they reached the Tigris River, news of Darius's preparations filled the air. The Persian king had chosen a battlefield near a village called Gaugamela, north of the ruins of Nineveh. It was said to be perfectly flat, ideal for the maneuvering of the Persian war, chariots, and cavalry. Darius had cleared the ground of obstacles, ensuring that nothing would hinder the full force of his army. Alexander's scouts brought back reports of an enemy force so large it seemed to stretch beyond the horizon. Estimates ranged from 100,000 to more than 200,000 men, though ancient numbers were often inflated. The Macedonian army, by comparison, numbered perhaps 40,000, but it was disciplined, experienced, and led by a commander whose confidence had only grown since the desert. The night before the battle, the Macedonian camp was calm. According to some accounts, Alexander slept soundly, unconcerned. His officers, however, moved quietly through the ranks, ensuring every soldier knew their position and role. There would be no second chances. On the morning of October 1st, 331 BCE, the two armies faced each other under a pale sky. The Persians spread across the plain in a vast crescent, their chariots gleaming with blades fixed to their wheels. Darius stood in the center, high on a platform so his troops could see him. Alexander's formation was tighter, his cavalry positioned on the flanks, his phalanx at the center. As the battle began, the Persians surged forward, chariots racing toward the Macedonian lines. Dust rose in thick clouds, the sound of hoofbeats like distant thunder. Alexander, ever the opportunist, led a wedge of cavalry directly toward a gap forming in the Persian left. His timing was perfect. The gap widened, and with it, a path to Darius himself. Seeing the danger, Darius turned his chariot and fled. The sight rippled through the Persian ranks, turning order into collapse by the day's end. The field was littered with broken spears, abandoned chariots, and the remnants of one of the largest armies ever assembled. The Persian Empire, though not yet fully conquered, had been broken in spirit. Babylon, Susa, and Persepolis would soon open their gates to Alexander. Yet the victory also marked a turning point. The further Alexander moved from Greece, the more he seemed to see himself as a ruler of the world, rather than merely a Macedonian king. The fusion of cultures, the divine titles, the vast projects, all would grow from here. Still, one question remained. Had the oracle at Siwa seen this moment, this victory at Gaugamela? Or was Alexander's destiny something he shaped entirely by his own will, using belief as one of his most effective weapons? Asterisk. Before Alexander became the conqueror of empires, before Egypt and Gaugamela, there was a city whose defiance would set the tone for his early reign. Thebes, nestled in the region of Boeotia. Thebes was a city of stone walls and deep pride, surrounded by fertile fields and backed by the dark mass of Mount Cithaeron. It was a city of contradictions, famous for its victories over Sparta in the days of Epaminondas and Pelopidas, yet equally known for its shifting alliances and political unrest. Thebes had once stood with Athens against Persia, but it also allied with Persia against other Greek states when Philip II of Macedon was assassinated in 336 BCE. The stability of the Macedonian kingdom appeared uncertain. Alexander, just 20 years old, had inherited his father's throne. Across Greece, whispers of rebellion stirred. Some cities saw an opportunity to break free from Macedonian control. In Thebes' case, those whispers became speeches, and speeches became plans. Memories of past glories mixed with resentment of Macedonian dominance. They heard rumors that Alexander had been killed in a campaign to the north. The city's leaders decided to act. Thebes' revolt was both sudden and calculated. The garrison of Macedonian troops stationed in the city was besieged in the Cadme, the citadel that stood like a silent watchtower over the streets. The Thebans sent messages to Athens and other cities, calling for a united uprising against Macedonia. But Alexander was not dead. He had moved with astonishing speed from campaigns in Thrace, covering hundreds of kilometers in little more than 2 weeks. Sudden appearance at the gates of Thebes caught the rebels unprepared. The Macedonian army encircled the city, their campfires lighting the night like a warning. Cassander offered terms. The Thebans could surrender their leaders, pay a fine, and be spared. The Thebans refused, their pride outweighing caution. Life inside the walls grew tense. Merchants spoke in low voices, unsure whether to prepare for war or seek a way out. Farmers from the surrounding countryside crowded into the city, bringing whatever supplies they could carry. The markets grew quieter, bread more expensive, and the air thicker with anticipation. When the attack began, it was not the long siege some had expected. Macedonian troops assaulted the gates at dawn, while others scaled the walls at weak points. Fighting spilled into narrow streets where hoplites clashed in tight formations. The sound of bronze on bronze echoing between stone buildings. The Thebans fought fiercely. Alexander's forces were disciplined and numerous. As the defense faltered, panic rippled through the city. Some fled toward the Cadme. Others tried to escape into the countryside. By nightfall, Thebes had fallen. Alexander ordered a punishment that would send shockwaves across Greece. The city was destroyed, its population enslaved, and its territory divided among its neighbors. Only the temples and the house of the poet Pindar were spared, gesture that mixed respect with ruthlessness. The fall of Thebes was more than a military victory. It was a message. Greece would remain under Macedonian control, and any challenge would be met, not just with force, but with finality. Yet one wonders, in crushing Thebes so completely, did Alexander strengthen his rule, or plant the first seeds of resistance that would follow him for the rest of his life? Asterisk. The morning after Thebes fell was unlike any the city had known. There was no dawn chorus of merchants calling to one another, no sound of hooves on the stone-paved streets, no chatter of children darting between stalls. Instead, there was a stillness broken only by the measured tread of Macedonian soldiers and the crackle of small fires burning in the ruins. Thebes, a city that had once rivaled Athens in power, now lay in fragments. The proud towers that guarded its gates were smashed, their stones scattered in heaps. Streets that had echoed with festival processions and military parades now wound through rubble, broken walls, and abandoned doorways. The air held the mingled smells of smoke, dust, in the iron tank of blood. Alexander's orders had been clear and precise. Every building except temples and the home of Pindar was to be razed. Citizens who survived the assault were gathered in the agora, their fates decided by lists drawn up by the Macedonian command. Families were split apart. Men, women, and children were sold into slavery across Greece, their names and stories vanishing into the ledgers of traders. The few who remained priests, envoys, and those under special protection moved like shadows in the ruined city. The temple stood untouched, their columns stark against the emptiness around them. Inside, the priests performed rituals as they always had, their chants echoing in spaces now surrounded by destruction. For them, the gods must still be served, even when the city was gone. News of Thebes' destruction traveled fast. Its messengers on horseback rode to Athens, Corinth, and beyond, carrying the tale of what Alexander had done. In the halls of other city-states, leaders debated their options. Some argued for resistance, but many saw the ruin of Thebes as proof that defiance meant annihilation. Envoys from Athens were sent north, offering gestures of loyalty that might have been unthinkable only weeks earlier. For Alexander, this was a calculated act. He knew the Greek world was watching. By making Thebes an example, he secured his control without having to fight a dozen. Asterisk, 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 asses asterisk, assets, well, as and the armies of Macedonia could now march east toward Persia, with Greece firmly and fearfully in his grasp. But the memory of Thebes would not fade entirely. Among Greek exiles and mercenaries, tales of its fall became a rallying cry. They spoke of betrayal, of the loss of one of Greece's great cities, of the day when the streets ran red and the air was filled with the sound of collapsing walls. In later years, some would quietly question Alexander's choice. Could a lighter hand have kept Greece loyal? Or was the iron fist the only way to hold a land of fiercely independent cities together? And so, Thebes became both a warning and a wound, a reminder of what was lost, and a shadow over Alexander's glittering victories to come. But what became of the survivors who were scattered across Greece? How did they live, carrying the memory of their city's destruction into foreign streets? Asterisk, when the Macedonian soldiers marched the Theban captives away, they did so in columns that stretched far beyond the city walls. The sun was high, and the dust from their passage hung in the air like a pale curtain. Men were bound with ropes at their wrists, so women carried children or clutched small bundles of possessions. The youngest walked barefoot, their faces streaked with soot from the fires that had swallowed their homes. They moved toward different destinies, though most did not know where the road would end. Some were taken to Corinth, others to Euboea, others still to islands where they would be sold in slave markets unfamiliar with their names or history. For these displaced Thebans, survival became a matter of adaptation. They learned to work in the households of strangers, to speak without revealing too much of where they came from, to accept the small mercies of shelter and food. A few were bought by wealthy patrons who valued them for their skills, scribes, craftsmen, musicians, and in these rare cases, traces of Theban culture seeped quietly into other cities. But identity was harder to preserve. without the walls, the agora, the festivals, and the temples. The idea of being Theban became something you carried in memory rather than in daily life. Parents told their children stories of the city's 7 gates, of the great battles of old, of the poets and heroes whose names were carved in stone. These stories were sometimes all that connected them to what had been lost. Meanwhile, the places where Thebes had once stood, nature began its slow reclamation. Grass pushed up between the stones. Vines crept over the lower walls that had not been dismantled. The few remaining citizens who had been spared, priests in the temples, and the family of Pindar lived in a quiet that was deeper than before. Their routines bound to the cycles of the gods and seasons. In Athens, philosophers debated the ethics of Alexander's decision. Is it necessary to destroy a city to preserve order? Or had he crossed a line that even a conqueror should respect? These questions had no consensus, but they rippled through speeches and writings, leaving behind another kind of legacy, one of moral inquiry. Years later, travelers passing through the ruins would describe the place with hushed voices. The stones were still there, but the life that had animated them was gone. And in that absence, the silence spoke more loudly than any storyteller. Thebes, in the end, became a kind of paradox, erased as a political power, but immortal as a cautionary tale. Its fall marked the closing of one chapter in Greek independence. It's a chapter that would never be reopened, and perhaps the most haunting question was this: if Thebes, with all its walls, warriors, and history, could be reduced to dust in a matter of days, what city in Greece could truly believe itself safe? The year was 322 BCE, and Athens, once the restless heartbeat of Greek politics and culture, had grown quieter. Not silent, for the city still bustled with merchants, philosophers, and craftsmen, but quieter in the sense that the energy of its golden age had thinned. Like the fading echo of a once loud chorus, the marble temples of the Acropolis still caught the light in the morning, their columns rising into the sky with the same grace they had held for generations. The agora still filled with the scent of fresh bread, fish from Piraeus, teas, and the chatter of sellers calling out to customers. But in the assembly, the speeches had grown more careful. The fierce, unrestrained debates of earlier years had been replaced by tones of caution, shaped by the knowledge that the Macedonians were always listening. Athens had surrendered its navy years before. Its empire, built on the tribute of subject cities and secured by fleets that once dominated the Aegean, had been reduced to a memory preserved in orations and marble inscriptions, but not in action. The walls that once connected the city to the port of Piraeus had been torn down, rebuilt, and torn down again over the decades. It's a physical symbol of Athens' fluctuating power. The philosophers continued their work. At the Lyceum, Aristotle's students walked shaded colonnades, their sandals brushing against worn stone as they debated the nature of the soul or the purpose of the state. In the academy, followers of Plato maintained a tradition of reasoned inquiry. But even here, the mood was tempered. Political theory was still discussed, but the practical ambition to apply it to Athens' governance had largely faded for ordinary Athenians. Life carried on in cycles, dictated less by politics than by the seasons and markets. Farmers from Attica brought their produce to sell. Craftsmen worked in the narrow streets, shaping clay, stone, or bronze. In the evenings, small gatherings were held, where wine was poured and poetry recited. Yet in these moments of leisure, there lingered a sense of looking backward, a nostalgia for Pericles' Athens. When the Parthenon was new, and when the city's voice carried across the Greek world, the Macedonian presence was not always visible, but it was felt. Athens was allowed to retain its nominal independence. It was a careful independence. One maintained by avoiding actions that might provoke the attention of Antipater, Alexander's regent in Greece. The city still sent embassies, still voted on civic matters, but always within the limits of what the Macedonians would tolerate in the shadow of the Knicks. The rocky hill where citizens once gathered to decide the fate of war and peace, the assembly met less frequently. The speeches were shorter, the proposals narrower. The radical energy that had once driven Athens to confront Sparta, Persia, and even Macedonia itself seemed now like a luxury it could no longer afford. And so Athens entered a kind of political twilight. It still shone in art, philosophy, and memory, but the edges of its influence were eroding. The empire was gone, the navy dismantled, the democracy cautious, and yet it still stood, still beautiful, still proud, still unwilling to admit openly that the center of power had shifted north. But if Athens could survive in this diminished state, the question was whether it could truly thrive under such watchful oversight. And perhaps more importantly, how long could it hold on before even this quiet independence slipped away? Asterisk when news reached Athens in 323 BCE that Alexander the Great was dead. It moved through the city like a sudden wind, stirring the air and lifting the dust from the streets. At first, the reaction was cautious. No one knew if the news was true, and no one could predict how the Macedonian garrisons scattered across Greece would respond. But within days, the embers of defiance began to glow. Athens had lived under Macedonian dominance since the crushing defeat at Chaeronea in 338 BCE, while Alexander's campaigns in Asia had drawn the gaze of the known world eastward. The cities of Greece had simmered under a watchful peace enforced by his generals. But now, with the great conqueror gone, questions whispered in the streets and in the shaded courtyards. Was this the moment to reclaim freedom? The answer came swiftly in the form of alliances. Athens reached out to Aetolia and other Greek states, forming what became known as the Lamian League. It was not a grand Panhellenic uprising. Too many cities feared Macedon's power, but it was enough to raise armies. Themistocles had once told Athens that its strength lay in its navy, but now it would have to rely on a coalition of hoplites, mercenaries, and hastily summoned levies. Leosthenes, an Athenian commander of considerable skill, took charge. His charisma and determination inspired the assembly to vote for war. And for a brief, heady moment, it felt as though Athens had rediscovered its old voice. The citizenry brought forth arms. The dockyards stirred again, and war councils met late into the night. The opening months of the Lamian War went well. Antipater, the Macedonian regent in Greece, was caught off guard and forced to retreat to Lamia, a fortified city in Thessaly. The Athenians laid siege, and for the first time in decades, the idea that Macedonian power could be broken did not seem entirely foolish. The war is not decided in moments of optimism. The siege dragged on, and Antipater's allies began to gather. Macedonian reinforcements arrived from Asia, bringing with them veterans hardened by years of campaigning under Alexander. Leosthenes fell in battle, a sudden loss that drained the morale of the Greek forces. Leadership shifted, strategies faltered, and the momentum began to slip away. By the summer of 322 BCE, Tyre's confrontation came at the Battle of Chaeronea. The Macedonian cavalry, disciplined and relentless, broke the Greek lines. The battle was not a catastrophic slaughter. The Greek forces retreated in order. But it was enough to convince each member of the Lamian League to sue for peace. Individually, Athens, once a defiant leader of the resistance, now found itself isolated and forced to negotiate from weakness. The terms were severe. Macedonian troops occupied the city. The assembly was purged, with political rights stripped from thousands of poorer citizens, leaving only the wealthiest Athenians eligible to participate. A Macedonian garrison took up residence in the port of Munichia, a constant reminder of who truly ruled, the dream of reclaiming the democracy's former glory. had flickered brightly for less than a year before being snuffed out. And yet, in its extinguishing, it left behind not only the bitterness of defeat, but also the uneasy question: had Athens just fought its last war as a truly free city? Asterisk, the Macedonian garrison that took root in Munichia was not a transient presence. Its high walls and disciplined soldiers became as much a part of Athens' skyline as the Acropolis itself. Every morning, Athenians who walked along the Piraeus Road could see the pennants fluttering from the battlements, a reminder that the city's fate was no longer its own. Life adjusted, as it always does, under occupation. The market still bustled, fishmongers still called out their prices. The scent of bread from the bakeries still drifted through the narrow streets, but the tone was different. Discussions in the agora were quieter, more guarded. The old, fiery debates, the kind that once filled the assembly and spilled into taverns, were replaced by cautious exchanges. One did not know who might be listening. The assembly itself, once the heartbeat of Athenian democracy, was no longer the voice of the people. The property requirement imposed by the Macedonians had stripped away the participation of thousands. Men who had once spoken passionately in the Knicks now stood idle at the edges of political life, their opinions reduced to whispers in private homes. The city's leaders learned to work within the constraints of Macedonian oversight. Some justified this as prudence. Athens could not risk another war, not after the Lamian defeat. Others saw it as collaboration, a slow surrender of identity. For many ordinary Athenians, the question was more immediate: how to feed their families, how to keep their trades alive, how to avoid trouble. The festivals continued, though even these bore the subtle mark of change. The Panathenaic procession still wound its way to the Acropolis, but fewer citizens carried arms in its ranks. Foreign troops watched from a distance, not interfering, but making their presence felt. Plays were still performed in the theater of Dionysus. Yet the playwrights avoided subjects that might stir dangerous comparisons between past and present. Athens had been defeated before by Sparta in the Peloponnesian War, by Persia in earlier centuries, but those defeats had always been followed by a renewal, a return to self-rule. This time, the defeat felt heavier, more permanent. Macedonian power was not a temporary occupation, but part of a larger structure, an empire with resources and ambition that dwarfed the city's capacity to resist. And yet, in the quiet rhythms of daily life, there remained a subtle defiance. Scholars in the Lyceum continued their lectures, passing on knowledge to the next generation. Philosophers debated ethics and the nature of the good life, even if the political life they spoke of was slipping into memory. Craftsmen still inscribed dedications to the gods, as though invoking divine favor might one day bring change. The fall of Athens was not a single event, but a drawn-out fading, gradual erosion of the freedoms that had defined it. There was no burning of the Parthenon, no dramatic siege to mark the final end. Instead, the city lived on, diminished but intact, its stones still white in the Attic sun, its people still proud but subdued. The question lingered in the minds of those who remembered better days. Was Athens still Athens, if it no longer ruled itself? Asterisk, the island of Rhodes, lying at the edge of the Aegean in the eastern Mediterranean, was not an empire in itself, but it was a power in its own way, a trading hub, a maritime crossroads, and a fortress of stone and ingenuity. After the rise of Alexander the Great, when the Hellenistic world fractured into rival kingdoms, Rhodes found itself both in demand and in danger. The city of Rhodes, built on the northern tip of the island, was a place of deliberate design. Its streets were laid out in a grid, following the principles of Hippodamus, the same urban planner whose ideas had shaped other great cities of the Greek world. Ships from Egypt, Syria, and Macedonia came to its harbors, bringing grain, wine, timber, and precious metals. Merchants here spoke in many tongues, and gold coins bearing the image of the sun god Helios passed quickly from hand to hand. Its harbor was the heart of its wealth and its vulnerability. Roads controlled shipping lanes that connected the Aegean to the Levant, making it a valuable ally and a tempting prize. It maintained a powerful navy, smaller than the fleets of the great kingdoms, but disciplined and efficient. The Rhodians also invested in walls, high and thick, reinforced with stone towers that looked out over the sea. These were not walls built in complacency, They were meant to withstand a siege. In the years following Alexander's death, the generals who carved up his empire, the Diadochi, turned on one another. Ptolemy in Egypt, Seleucus in Asia, Cassander in Macedonia, Lysimachus in Thrace, and Antigonus in Asia Minor all sought allies to strengthen their positions. Rhodes, with its strategic location, became a player in these shifting alliances, though the Rhodians preferred trade to war. Their trouble came when Antigonus, the ambitious ruler of much of Asia Minor, decided to challenge their independence. His son, Demetrius, already famous for his skill in siege warfare, was sent to take the city. In 305 BCE, Demetrius' fleet appeared on the horizon, a forest of masts and sails against the blue of the sea. The Rhodians had known this day might come. They had stored grain in their warehouses, readied their ships, and summoned allies. But they also knew they faced one of the most formidable siege engineers of the age. Demetrius had earned the name Poliorcetes, the besieger of cities, for his use of massive siege towers, battering rams, and catapults. In the first days of the siege, his ships ringed the harbor, cutting roads off from reinforcements. His engineers began assembling a siege tower unlike any the Greeks had seen before, the Helepolis, or taker of cities, a wooden giant 9 stories high, bristling with weapons and shielded in iron. Slowly, its framework rose on the shore, while inside the city, the Rhodians reinforced their walls and prepared for the assault. The air in Rhodes was tense, but not panicked. Its people had faced danger before. They knew that their survival depended on patience and discipline. Farmers from the countryside had already moved into the city, swelling its population, while sailors remained in the harbor, ready to fight if an opening appeared. Priests made offerings to Helios, asking for protection, while artisans turned their skills to making weapons and repairing the defenses. Yet, even with all their preparation, the question hung over the city. Could Rhodes truly withstand the full force of Demetrius' siege machines? The great siege tower, the Helepolis, was unlike anything Rhodes had ever seen. Demetrius' engineers had designed it as both a weapon and a symbol, a moving fortress meant to intimidate as much as destroy. Rising nearly 40 meters high, its frame was built from sturdy timber, sheathed in plates of iron to resist fire. Inside, ramps and platforms allowed archers and catapult crews to operate on multiple levels, each able to hurl projectiles deep into the city. It stood on massive wheels, each taller than a man, which allowed it to be pushed slowly toward the walls. The very sight of it on the shoreline was enough to make merchants and laborers pause in their work. It looked less like a machine and more like some unnatural creature, a wooden giant that could swallow buildings whole. But the Rhodians did not simply watch. From the safety of their walls, they harassed the workers assembling the tower, firing arrows, hurling stones, and sending quick night raids to burn supplies. They knew they could not stop the Helepolis from being built. Demetrius' forces were too many, disciplined, but they could delay its completion and drain their enemies' resources inside the city. The leadership coordinated the defense with the precision of a merchant fleet setting sail. Citizens were divided into teams, each responsible for a section of the wall. Cisterns were kept full in case of fire, and narrow passageways between the inner and outer defenses allowed troops to move quickly without being seen. Then, one morning, the Helepolis began to move. It was a slow, grinding process, each rotation of its great wheels pushed forward by hundreds of men and aided by a system of pulleys. Behind it marched soldiers carrying shields and ladders, ready to exploit any breach in the walls. From its upper levels, catapults launched stones the size of amphorae, smashing into towers and ramparts. The Rhodians responded with every trick they knew. They rolled barrels of pitch down the slopes toward the machine, set fire to bundles of brushwood, and tried to undermine the ground beneath its wheels. They sent out fast-moving fireships against Demetrius' blockade, burning some and forcing others to pull back. Still, the siege dragged on. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. The strain on the city grew. Grain had to be rationed, water carefully measured. The fishermen who once filled the harbor with their catch now stood guard on the walls, their nets useless against siege engines. Outside the walls, Demetrius' camp was a city in itself, rows of tents, workshops for carpenters and blacksmiths, kitchens that baked bread for thousands. The besieger was patient. He knew Rhodes' wealth, its position, and its reputation. He also knew that if the city fell, it would serve as a warning to all who thought to resist him. But inside the city, another thought began to grow. Perhaps, even against such odds, Rhodes might outlast him. By the turn of the year, the siege had become less a battle and more a test of endurance. Demetrius had committed enormous resources to taking roads, ships, engineers, and an army large enough to feed its own hunger for supplies. But Rhodes' position on the sea meant that while Demetrius' fleet could block many approaches, it could not seal every gap. Merchant ships, hired from allies, slipped into the harbor under the cover of darkness or in the midst of storms. The Rhodians had learned to use weather as their ally. When high winds blew in from the sea, they knew the great helepolis could not be moved without risk of it toppling. Rain turned the ground into mud, making siege works nearly useless. At times, defenders even released large quantities of water from cisterns onto the slopes before their walls, creating a slick, muddy barrier that slowed siege towers to a crawl. It was not just stubbornness that kept the Rhodians fighting. They had a cause that bound merchant, soldier, and laborer together, the defense of their autonomy. Rhodes was not merely a fortified harbor. It was a center of trade, diplomacy, and maritime law. To lose it would be to lose not just territory, but identity. Demetrius made one final push, ordering the helepolis into position for a direct assault on the city walls. His engineers reinforced it, patched over fire damage, and stocked it with fresh ammunition. But as it neared the walls, the defenders unleashed a counterattack unlike any before. They concentrated their heaviest artillery on the base of the tower, striking its wheels and lower supports. Archers targeted the crews inside. At the same time, sappers dug beneath its approach, weakening the ground until the machine became bogged down and stuck. After weeks of failed assaults, Demetrius recognized that Rhodes would not fall easily, and more importantly, that his political aims elsewhere demanded his attention. He negotiated a peace. Rhodes would remain autonomous, though allied with Demetrius' father, Antigonus. The siege was lifted when Demetrius' forces sailed away. They left behind siege engines, weapons, and the massive timbers of the abandoned helepolis. The Rhodians, practical as ever, sold the bronze and iron and used the proceeds to commission a monument that would symbolize their survival, a colossal statue of the sun god Helios standing at the harbor. This was the Colossus of Rhodes, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. The statue did not stand forever. It would fall to an earthquake within a century, and its remains would lie in ruin for centuries more. Yet, the memory of the siege, of resisting one of the most powerful armies of the Greek world, lived on in Rhodes' identity, and it leaves us to wonder The balance between overwhelming force and determined defense. Is it the size of the army or the resolve of a city that truly decides the outcome? Asterisk. By 301 BCE, the empire of Alexander the Great had splintered into a patchwork of rival kingdoms, each ruled by one of his former generals, the Diadochi. For 2 decades after Alexander's death, these men had fought, allied, betrayed, and fought again, each claiming to be the true heir to his legacy. But no single man had the strength to rule the whole in Asia Minor. Antigonus Monothelmus, the one knight, had grown powerful enough to threaten them all. From his capital in Phrygia, he and his son Demetrius Poliorcetes held vast territories, from the mountains of Anatolia to parts of Syria and Greece. His ambition was clear: to reunite Alexander's empire under his own rule. The other successors saw the danger. Lysimachus, who ruled Thrace and much of western Asia Minor, forged an alliance with Cassander of Macedon and Seleucus, the king of a vast eastern realm stretching into Babylon. They agreed to strike before Antigonus could consolidate his power. The stage was set for Ipsus, a small town in Phrygia where their armies would meet. The size of the forces was staggering for the time: tens of thousands of infantry, thousands of cavalry, and, most unusually, hundreds of war elephants brought west by Seleucus from his campaigns in India. The elephants were not merely symbolic. In the ancient battlefield's open plain, they could be used to break cavalry charges, disrupt infantry formations, and create panic among horses unused to their scent and sound. Their presence at Ipsus would prove decisive. As both armies gathered, the scale of the battle became apparent to all involved. This was not a raid or a siege. It was a test of supremacy that could decide the fate of Alexander's empire. Villages near Ipsus emptied as civilians fled the coming clash, carrying what they could to safety. Farmers abandoned fields just before harvest, their crops left standing as the armies advanced. On the morning of the battle, the plain shimmered under the Anatolian sun. The lines stretched so far that a soldier on one flank could barely see the banners of his own army's far end. Trumpets and drums echoed across the field. Poor elephants stood in ranks, their tusks capped with bronze, handlers armed with pikes, ready to ward off attackers. Antigonus was confident. At 80 years old, he still rode at the head of his troops, his one eye scanning the enemy lines. Beside him, Demetrius commanded the cavalry, known for their speed and striking power. Across the field, Seleucus and Lysimachus prepared their own strategies. They knew they could not match Demetrius in open cavalry combat, but the elephants, positioned to block his return, would be their answer. The tension on that plain was more than military. It was the weight of decades of rivalry, the lingering shadow of Alexander's conquests, and the question of who, if anyone, could claim his legacy. And as the first horns sounded to signal the advance, one might wonder, was this truly a battle for empire, or merely the last great struggle of men who could not share what they had inherited? Asterisk. The first movements of the Battle of Ipsus followed a pattern familiar to Hellenistic warfare: cavalry wings sweeping forward, skirmishers loosing, javelins, and heavy infantry advancing in slow, disciplined ranks. But the presence of so many elephants altered everything. Demetrius, leading the Antigonic cavalry on their right flank, launched a powerful charge against the opposing cavalry of Lysimachus. His riders, clad in gleaming armor, lances lowered, smashed into the enemy line with practiced precision. For a time, Demetrius pushed them back, driving deep toward the enemy rear. His father, Antigonus, watched with satisfaction, convinced the day would be theirs. But Seleucus had anticipated this. The Indian elephants, positioned in reserve, moved forward under the guidance of their mahouts. Trumpets blared as the animals formed a living barrier between Demetrius and the main battlefield. The war horses balked at the smell and sound of the elephants. Riders struggled to maintain control. Cut off, Demetrius found himself unable to return to aid his father. The Antigonid cavalry, trapped beyond the main engagement, became a force out of place, victorious in their own skirmish, but absent from the critical center, in the heart of the battle. The infantry lines ground together. The Macedonian phalanx, with its dense wall of sarissas, held firm at first. Antigonus, in the center, urged them forward, shouting encouragement. Yet without cavalry support, the pressure from Seleucus's and Lysimachus's troops began to tell. Seleucus then deployed another tactic, a controlled advance of the elephants directly into the flanks of the Antigonide infantry. The great beasts, armored and draped in heavy cloths, trampled through looser formations, forcing men to scatter. Gaps opened in Antigonus's line, and through these, enemy troops poured in. The midday sun was high when the turning point came. Antigonus, still mounted, tried to rally his men, calling for Demetrius, unaware that his son was effectively penned in by the elephant. The one-eyed king, who had survived decades of war, stood exposed as the enemy closed around him. The moment is described in later sources with a mix of awe and finality. A Cade javelin struck Antigonus, and he fell from his horse. His death was seen by his troops, and the effect was immediate. Morale collapsed. Units began to retreat, some throwing down their pikes, others running toward the hills. Seleucus and Lysimachus did not pursue recklessly. They had won a decisive victory, and they knew it. The body of Antigonus was treated with respect, a final gesture to a rival who had once been a comrade in arms under Alexander. By evening, the battlefield was a grim sight, dust settling over trampled earth, broken weapons, and the carcasses of war elephants. The alliance of Seleucus and Lysimachus stood unchallenged. Victory reshaping the map of the Hellenistic world. But for Demetrius, Tar, now in command of scattered survivors, the battle was not only a defeat, it was the end of his father's ambitions and the collapse of a united Antigonid claim to Alexander's legacy. The empire had fractured further, perhaps beyond repair, and yet, in the shifting politics of the age, one question lingered. Would any of these successors ever truly be able to hold what Alexander had left behind? The dust of the battlefield at Ipsus did not settle quickly, even as the last cries of the wounded faded into the stillness of the evening. The scale of the Antigonid defeat became undeniable. Antigonus, the one knight, lay dead, his once formidable army shattered. His death was more than the loss of a commander. It was the death of a centralizing vision, the dream that the fragments of Alexander's empire could be welded back together under a single ruler. The victors, Seleucus and Lysimachus, moved quickly to consolidate their gains. They convened with Cassander, the king of Macedonia, and another of the successors to divide Antigonus's territories. This partition was pragmatic, also a demonstration of the political reality of the era. Power was a currency to be negotiated as much as fought for. Seleucus claimed the largest share. He absorbed much of the eastern portion of Antigonus's realm, linking it to his already vast territories in Asia. Lysimachus expanded into Western Asia Minor, strengthening his position near the Aegean. Cassander, although not present at Ipsus, secured recognition over Macedonia and Greece. And what of Demetrius? The young king who had fought with such brilliance, yet found himself, outmaneuvered, now retreated to Ephesus with the remnants of his cavalry. His loss at Ipsus did not end his career. Indeed, he would later seize the throne of Macedonia, but the battle had stripped him of resources and allies. For the moment, he was a fugitive king without a kingdom. The war elephants that had played such a decisive role at Ipsus became a symbol of Seleucus's dominance, brought from India through alliances and campaigns years before. These animals were more than weapons. They were reminders of how far the Hellenistic world now stretched. The roots that supplied them connected Greek politics to the distant lands of the Indus Valley. A web of influence that Alexander had first woven in his successors now sought to maintain for the ordinary people in the territories once ruled by Antigonus. The change of rulers brought little immediate relief. Tax collectors still came. Garrisons still demanded supplies. Cities like Sardis and Ephesus adapted quickly, swearing loyalty to the new authorities in exchange for stability. Rural farmers, as always, had little say in the matter there. Lives were measured by harvests, not by who claimed kingship in far-off capitals. Historians would later note that Ipsus marked the definitive end of any realistic hope for reunification of Alexander's empire. From this point forward, the Hellenistic world was a patchwork of competing kingdoms: Seleucid in the east, Ptolemaic in Egypt, Antigonid in parts of Macedonia, Lysimachd in Thrace, in Asia Minor, at least until those borders shifted again, as they inevitably would. It is tempting to imagine that the successors might have realized the futility of endless war after Ipsus, that they could have built a lasting peace. But in truth, the lesson most of them drew was that power could be seized if one moved decisively and struck at the right moment. The generation that followed continued the pattern. Alliances formed and dissolved. Armies marched, and cities changed hands as often as seasons changed. Yet, in the quiet fields around Ipsus, long after the kings and their ambitions had passed into history, the land itself returned to its rhythms. Its grass grew over forgotten graves, and the stone markers of the dead weathered under the Anatolian sun. For those who walked there centuries later, the wind carried no memory of war, only the faint sound of rustling leaves and distant herds. And perhaps that is the truest legacy of Ipsus, not the lines on a map drawn in its aftermath, a T, but the reminder that even the most decisive of human struggles eventually fade, leaving only the earth beneath as their witness. Asterisk in the spring light of 337 BCE. The city of Corinth bustled with an unusual air of ceremony. Delegations from across the Greek world arrived not for a festival or games, but for something more solemn: the creation of a political order, unlike anything the fractured Greek city-states had known before. Here, on the narrow isthmus that connected the Peloponnese to the rest of Greece, a grand experiment was taking shape. Philip II of Macedon had summoned the leaders of nearly every major city-state to assemble in council. For decades, Greece had been torn by war: Sparta's dominance after the Peloponnesian War, Thebes' brief rise, Athens' naval ambitions, and the countless shifting alliances that turned neighbors into enemies overnight. By the time Philip's armies arrived on the scene, the very notion of a united Hellas seemed impossible. Yet Philip understood both the weariness and the pride of the Greek world. The Corinthian League, as it would be called by later historians, is designed to preserve the autonomy of each city-state while binding them together under a common cause, a mutual defense pact, a framework for resolving disputes, and, most ambitiously, a shared campaign against the Persian Empire. The assembly at Corinth was a study in contrasts. Spartan envoys, famously austere, sat in plain cloaks beside Athenians draped in fine robes, their polished speeches full of carefully chosen words. Delegates from small towns, places that rarely made it into the annals of history, found themselves voting alongside the representatives of great powers. For once, the sharp edges of rivalry seemed blunted by the scale of the moment. Philip's terms were clear. The League would guarantee the independence of its members, forbid internal warfare, and coordinate military action against Persia. Each city would contribute forces proportionate to its size and wealth. Council, or Synedrion, would meet regularly to deliberate policy. The king of Macedon would serve as hegemon, the military leader of the League. But in theory, the political will of the alliance rested with its members. For Philip, This was both a diplomatic triumph and a practical necessity. The Persian Empire, though weakened by internal strife, was still vast, wealthy, and capable of raising armies far larger than any single Greek state could muster. Greece were to challenge Persia and claim revenge for the invasions of Darius and Xerxes. A century and a half earlier, it had to act as one dot to the common citizen of Corinth, Athens, or Thebes. The league may have seemed distant from daily concerns. Farmers still tended their vineyards and olive groves. Fishermen still cast their nets, and artisans still labored in workshops. But the presence of so many envoys, the talk of a united campaign, and the sight of Macedonian troops in well-drilled formations suggested that change was in the air. Even the location was symbolic. Corinth, sitting at the crossroads of land and sea routes, had long been a meeting point of cultures and armies. To convene here was to signal that this was a matter for all of Greece, not merely the interests of a few dominant powers. Still, not all were convinced. Beneath the formal speeches and pledges, some envoys harbored doubts about Macedon's intentions. Was the league truly a partnership or a vehicle for Philip's control over Greece? Would the promise of mutual defense hold if the hegemon's interests clashed with those of its members? Yet, for the moment, the vision held. The league was sworn into being, oaths were exchanged, and preparations for the Persian campaign began. In the quiet after the assembly, the idea of a united Hellas seemed almost tangible, a fragile but luminous possibility in a world accustomed to division. But history, as it so often does, would test the limits of that unity. By the summer of 336 BCE, the machinery of the Corinthian League was beginning to turn. Oaths had been sworn, war levies calculated, and ships provisioned for the long journey east. Philip II had moved swiftly after the founding assembly, dispatching emissaries to every member state to coordinate the contribution of soldiers, sailors, and supplies in the marketplaces of Athens. Merchants spoke of new contracts for timber and bronze to outfit triremes. In Macedon's northern plains, cavalry squadrons trained with fresh mounts, their armor glinting in the sunlight. Even in small, landlocked cities, there was a stir of activity as hoplites prepared their shields and spears for what was promised to be the greatest campaign since the days of the Persian Wars. The Persian Empire was in a moment of vulnerability. Artaxerxes III, who had brought a degree of stability to the empire, had recently died. His successors faced a court intrigue and revolts in the provinces. Greek mercenaries, already serving in Persian armies, carried tales home of satraps unable to enforce central authority, of local rulers acting with increasing independence. For Philip, the time seemed perfect to strike, but the league's unity was still young and fragile, while official decrees proclaimed equality among member states. The reality was that Macedon's influence loomed over every decision. Macedonian officers were placed in key advisory roles, and the army's strategic planning was done in Pella, not in the council chambers of Corinth. Some cities quietly resented their assigned contributions, especially those still recovering from recent wars. Thebes, only a decade removed from being crushed by Macedonian arms, sent troops but kept a wary eye on Philip's intentions. Athens, though publicly cooperative, retained its powerful navy largely under its own command, ready to act in its own interests should the opportunity arise. Amid this political undercurrent, a single event would change everything. In the theater at Aegia, during the wedding celebrations of his daughter, Philip was assassinated, struck down by one of his own bodyguards. The motives have been debated ever since: a personal vendetta, a political conspiracy, or the result of court intrigues involving rival factions. Whatever the cause, the effect was immediate and profound. The campaign against Persia, which had seemed only months away from departure, ground to a halt. Macedon's succession was uncertain, Into this moment stepped Alexander, the 20-year-old son of Philip, proclaimed king by the Macedonian army. For the League, this was an untested figure, brilliant in youth, but without his father's decades of political and military experience. Some members of the League hesitated, wondering whether their oaths to Philip extended to his son. Athens. Debates in the assembly weighed the risks of defying Macedon against the possibility of regaining full independence. Thebes watched closely, recalling its humiliation under Philip. Alexander moved quickly to secure his position. He summoned the League's representatives to Corinth once more, demanding their reaffirmation of the alliance and their commitment to the Persian campaign, now under his leadership. The response would shape the fate of both the League and Greece itself. And in that moment, one question loomed over the isthmus. Would the vision of Greek unity survive the loss of the man who had created it? When Alexander arrived in Corinth in the winter following Philip's death, the city's council chambers still bore the marks of the first great assembly, the bronze plaques listing each member's obligations, the ceremonial standards of the cities, and the finely carved table at which Philip had presided. But the air was different now. The young Macedonian king entered not with the quiet authority of his father, but with the energy of someone determined to prove himself. He was greeted formally, though not warmly, by the representatives of the League's cities. The oaths sworn to Philip were no longer binding in the eyes of some, and everyone in the chamber knew it. Alexander stood before them, and, in a speech that has survived only in fragments, declared his intention to lead the campaign against Persia to its completion. He spoke of avenging the desecration of Greek temples, of freeing the Greek cities of Asia Minor from Persian control, and of securing the wealth of the East for all members of the League. His words echoed the same themes Philip had used, but with a sharper edge. To those who hesitated, Alexander offered a choice without subtlety: reaffirm the alliance or face the Macedonian army. Most chose reaffirmation. Athens, after some tense deliberation, renewed its oath. Corinth pledged its harbor. Even Thebes, though seething with resentment, signed again under the watch of Macedonian Garrisons, with the League intact. Alexander began preparations to resume the Persian campaign. Yet he did not leave Greece immediately. First, he moved to secure his rule through a display of decisive action. He marched north to quell rebellions among the Thracian tribes, then turned south to face the greatest test of the League's unity, Thebes, in 335 BCE. Thebes revolted, believing rumors that Alexander had died in the north. The city expelled the Macedonian garrison and called on other Greek states to rise against Macedon. No great coalition formed, but the defiance itself threatened to unravel the League. Alexander responded with speed that stunned the Greek world. Within days, his army appeared outside Thebes' walls. The siege was short and brutal. Thebes fell, and Alexander ordered the city destroyed, its people killed or sold into slavery, its buildings razed. Only temples and the house of the poet Pindar were spared. The message was unmistakable. The Corinthian League existed under Macedonian control, and defiance would be met with annihilation. In the aftermath, no other city dared rebel. Athens, though alarmed by the destruction of Thebes, stayed silent. The League's oaths were renewed once more, and Alexander was confirmed as its leader. By the following spring, the League's armies were assembled for the crossing into Asia. In name, it was a united Greek venture against Persia. In reality, it was a Macedonian-led enterprise, with the League serving as a political instrument to cloak Alexander's conquest in the language of Greek unity. The Corinthian League would not survive long beyond its founder's vision, though. It accompanied Alexander into the early years of his campaign. It faded into obscurity as the Macedonian Empire replaced the idea of an equal Greek alliance. By the time Alexander died, the League was a little more than a memory. a brief experiment in cooperation, overshadowed by the ambitions of a single dynasty. And so, one must wonder, was the League ever truly about Greek unity? Or was it only ever the tool of a king whose death revealed its fragility? In the late summer of